Ready for joining in. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome, everybody. Really delighted that people are joining in. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Jeff Abramson. I direct the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of about 150 people around the world concerned about the implications of the arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use. The Forum on the Arms Trade is about 10 years old now. It's a fiscally sponsored project of the Center for National Policy right now, where I'm a senior fellow, and it's also supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Really delighted you all could join in today. You won't see too much of me. I'm here to tell you a little bit more about the technology that we'll be using for this conference, and as well as just provide a little bit of frame before I turn it over. This is the third of 3 events as part of the Forums on the Arms Trade annual conference. The idea behind the conference was a couple of years ago, or it's hard to remember, that we were in the midst of a pandemic, and the United States had withdrawn its forces from Afghanistan. It seemed like a moment where security would be better defined by human security, where we would have maybe some more concerns about other issues besides a military approach. But unfortunately, shortly into the Biden administration, Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw awful destruction of civilian infrastructure. And then now we have the war in Gaza with Israel with similar concerns, raising the query of, is that the future? While at the same time, there's been many great things going on to move the humanitarian disarmament agenda forward that would provide rays of hope. And that's what today's meeting will be about. Yesterday's meeting was sort of on legal approaches that we're seeing, and on Tuesday, we talked about the United States. In terms of technology for this conference, you'll see that we are going to use the Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A. You can see all the Q&A as an audience member, and you can upvote questions so that we know which are the most popular. But we're also enabling the chat. You can chat. The audience is free to chat with each other as long as we remain respectful. I might put some things on the chat. That provides a little bit of an opportunity for you to feel engaged. It's also possible for you to verbally ask your questions. If you want to do that, please put them in the Q&A, but also then raise your hand. And at Bonnie's discretion, we might be able to call on you to verbally ask your questions to make this a little bit more interactive. But I'm really delighted to have the panel here. I'm sad to report that the ambassador, Christian from Costa Rica, unfortunately told us this morning of a medical emergency in his family, and he is unable to join us, and he sends his regrets. But with that, I'm really delighted to have Bonnie Doherty and the other panelists turn on their video. Bonnie Doherty helps lead the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative at the International Human Rights Clinic at the Harvard Law School, and who is a co-sponsor of today's event. Over to you, Bonnie, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. I want to welcome you all to this event, the ongoing Humanitarian Disarmament Agenda. And we're really pleased at the Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection Initiative to co-organize this event with the Forum on the Arms Trade. So today's arms conflict have presented a numerous challenges for civilian protection and raised a lot of concerns about the state of disarmament today. And this panel will recognize those challenges, but it also made clear that humanitarian disarmament can be used as a tool to address them. For those of you less familiar with the concept, humanitarian disarmament is a people-centered approach to governing weapons. Its goal is to prevent and remediate arms-inflicted human suffering and environmental harm. And its through the establishment and implementation of norms, and its process descends on a partnership of states, international organizations, and civil society. It also takes care to include the voices of affected communities and individuals. Our panelists today are well suited to address this topic because they have extensive experience in a variety of problematic weapons and in the process of humanitarian disarmament. So I'll introduce them briefly so we can get on to the discussion. So first, Alma Tazlijan works for Humanity and Inclusion and has worked extensively to bring the affected voices to the humanitarian disarmament table. She's also contributed to the negotiation and implementation of numerous instruments, including the Explosive Weapons Declaration, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Mine Ban Treaty. She's also chair of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines and Cluster Munition Coalition Governance Board, and a member of the steering committee of the International Network on Explosive Weapons. Peter Asaro is associate professor of the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York. He is vice chair of the steering committee of the Stop Killer Robots campaign and co-founder of the International Committee of Robot Arms Control. He's written extensively on autonomous weapon systems, addressing, among numerous topics, human rights and ethical issues. So both of them, I could go on their bios, but we'll keep it short and sweet. So to dig into we'll start with the challenges to dig into the topic. Alma, I'll start with you. So probably the most obvious challenges to civilian protection have involved the use and transfer of controversial, conventional weapons, such as explosive weapons, cluster munitions, and landmines. And I was wondering what you've seen in the areas you work on.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie, first for organizing this conference, to you both, Jeff and you, and for inviting me to speak today. I think the biggest challenge we are faced with today is really the nature of urban warfare, coupled with continuous use of inappropriate and indiscriminate, sometimes even illegal weapons. As a result, we have these horrific consequences that civilians are facing on a daily basis. And Jeff just asked us, should this be the future? I think we should all strive towards that. This is not the future of for all of us. So I think if we only look into the figures, we will see increased number of casualties, women and children among them. And then the first element is that rings the bells. But where we are disappointed to see is that the treaties that are governing the conduct of hostilities, that are created around the protection of a civilian life, are being watered down by different interpretations and not fully respected. What we also see is the devastation and destruction of civilian infrastructure. The vital services are collapsing, and it makes life in a war even more miserable and more dangerous. If we see hospital, for example, that is damaged or destroyed, we will not be able to provide emergency healthcare to those that are injured, but also we will not be able to provide healthcare to those with chronic diseases whose lives are depending on the care that they should receive. And if houses are destroyed, civilians will become homeless and they will be forced to search for a shelter. But if roads are destroyed and littered with unexploded ordnance, those that survive are even more exposed to danger. If schools are destroyed, or if it's not safe to move, children are losing years of education. So this is just a glimpse of the harm caused by the use of weapons. And then there is, of course, this question of sanity. How do people exposed to all this take care of their mental health? The psychological impact of urban warfare, continuous and relentless bombing and shelling, has a profound impact on civilians, including children. The constant threats, insecurity, uncertainty, experience of explosive violence leads to these severe mental health issues. We have seen people with PTSD, with anxiety, suicidal thoughts, depression, just to name few of these consequences. So what we see now is unfortunately nothing new. These are the patterns that we have seen before in the last few decades. And everything that we are working against or for is really to break these patterns and to put back the life of a civilian in the center of our discussion. It would be unreasonable to talk only about the impact of weapons and the responsibility only of those that use them. I think it's absolutely necessary to talk and to look into the responsibility of those that are providing those weapons. And I think even lately, when we have seen US providing banned cluster munitions to Ukraine for fifth time in a row, I believe, it paints a very clear picture how responsibility lays in both ends. The weapons being provided to fuel the war in Gaza are clearly causing these shocking civilian casualties, displacing civilians and destroying the infrastructure. The sale and the use of weapons come with profound responsibility. Both sellers, but also users, must uphold these strong standards that ensure safety, legality, and ethical conduct, recognizing the significant impact their actions have on civilians and the civilian infrastructure. Legal compliance is paramount for both those that provide and those that use the weapons, as I said, and cannot say too long on this because I want also to stress out that besides legalities, there are also moral and ethical considerations which are also crucial in this point. Sellers must be prepared to deny sales to individuals or states who pose a potential threat, and it's just potential threat, even regardless of whether they meet legal requirements or not. I may dare to say that there is a general feeling of disappointment in the political leadership when it comes to the impact of humanitarian disarmament initiatives. The Convention on Cluster Munitions clearly states no use by any actor under any circumstance. And same is for the landmines. The ATT clearly states that state parties should not authorize any transfer to grave breaches of Geneva Conventions, attacks against civilians, etc. So what we are experiencing is that state parties to all these treaties are not defending these norms that they have signed to. We are still waiting to hear from Ukraine how they are conducting research on reported use of landmines. But we are also waiting to hear from all state parties to the Mine Ban Treaty condemnation of such practice. Why are they not loudly condemning the use of, or the potential use of landmines by all actors in Ukraine right now? And same is for cluster munitions. It would be a collective failure of the political leadership if they pick and choose from these treaties what they like or what they feel that it's less demanding, and don't defend them and implement them as a whole, as they have legally committed to. These treaties are crafted with the aim to protect and reduce civilian harm on short and long term. And by fulfilling these responsibilities and implementation of these legal obligations, states can really help to create a safe and more responsible environment concerning weapon ownership and the use. And this is not merely a call for adherence, but really a request for a commitment to the highest standards of integrity and responsibility.
Thanks, Salma. I think you gave a really good picture of the range of problems, both the impacts in terms of physical, psychological harm, and infrastructure harm, and the use and the transfer, that it's a variety of states that are causing the problem. And also, I liked the way you presented it's both a legal and an ethical problem. So I think those are a lot of the problems that humanitarian disarmament needs to address. So thank you for laying that out so clearly. Peter, sort of focusing in on one more specific issue and also looking more forward. I was wondering what developments have taken place with regard to the increase in autonomy in military technology, and if you could give an example or two of those developments and explain how they relate to your work on autonomous weapon systems.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie, and thanks for the questions and putting this panel together, and Jeff and everyone involved. Yeah, so the campaign to stop killer robots is really focused on the technological control of targeting and the use of lethal force. And we've been working for more than a decade towards a treaty on this, and we've always framed that as a preemptive effort, that there aren't these kind of fully autonomous systems out there doing targeting on their own through software rather than human control. And we've always sort of nervously looked at each new conflict to see if there's going to be the use of these kinds of systems or what we've been calling precursor systems. Drones have been used for many years, but they were remote operated and there's humans making targeting decisions. But it also seems very easy to start replacing that with software. And we started to see really kind of the first potential use case, according to the United Nations, in the Libyan conflict, which used some of these Turkish drones that would identify humans and target them and sort of self-destruct, explode at them, and just kind of go after anything that looked human. So when the conflict erupted in Ukraine, where you have a sophisticated military state like Russia, as well as the Ukraine, which is also quite sophisticated, there was a lot of concern that we might see a lot of those sorts of weapons. And what we did see was a lot of drones being used and a lot of improvisation of commercial drones, like consumer DJI little quadcopters being adapted for both military surveillance, but also to carry, grenades and bombs and things to drop on troops and do reconnaissance for artillery. But we didn't see a whole lot of autonomy, at least not initially. Over the course of the last couple of years of that conflict, we have seen the development of the application and acquisition by Russia of these Iranian loitering munitions, which is another category of weapons that we've been monitoring over the last decade. Many of these are GPS guided, and that appears to be the predominant ones being used right now by Russia. But some might have in the future, and there are certainly many in development that could have more sophisticated kinds of autonomous targeting. And then in the most recent months, really just in kind of the last 6 months, we're starting to see reports of the development by Ukraine forces of drones that they're using to sort of dive bomb enemy positions that have terminal targeting systems. So Russia has deployed jamming systems so they can't remote operate these drones all the way to the target, but those jamming systems are fairly short range, like 100 meters. And they've actually just sort of soldiers in the field have written their own software to basically take an image of a tank or an artillery position and then have that drone autonomously fly into it, even if it loses the connection at the end. So it's a very kind of short-term form of autonomy, and we're of course keeping an eye on that and how that evolves. And I think the biggest lesson from that is just the speed with which militaries adapt to each other and adapt these technologies. And because a lot of it's software driven, that's a much faster kind of development cycle than we traditionally see in other kinds of weapon systems. And that's been very concerning. And of course, the war in Gaza and Israel has also been a great concern. And Israel has had advanced AI and autonomy development and many different kinds of weapon systems and platforms, from drones to loitering munitions to sentry guns to self-driving patrol vehicles that could potentially be armed and things like that. So we were very, interested to see what would happen, and that's been a very different and interesting conflict because of the level of social media coverage of it, along with a lot of very difficult to verify reports coming out of it. So that's really been a test of our monitoring abilities in a lot of ways. And also because a lot of these drones and loitering munitions, you don't necessarily know from observation how they're being operated, whether that's a remote operation or an autonomous operation. And something we've really been concerned with for many years within the campaign is automatic target recognition and generation. A lot of the discussion that's happened within the disarmament world, at least within the CCW, the Convention on Conventional Weapons in Geneva over the last decade, is really kind of, I think, framed maybe a little too much in a very traditional arms control concept. And even the meeting this morning, the consultations about how these meetings are going to go forward is like, how do we characterize an autonomous weapon. And it's this idea that it's a robot or a drone that's out there sort of targeting things on its own. But what we know about military operations is that these are large socio-technical systems, and you might have sensors or scouts, reporting information to a database, and then there's software that's analyzing that database. Targets get generated that goes to a team of people who plan targeting, and then that could go to a group of soldiers or a plane that might drop a bomb or a drone or any number of other kinds of systems. And so the concern there is, where is the human control and decision making over what is a lawful target? How are we avoiding civilians, civilian infrastructures, making discrimination and proportionality, as well as military necessity choices and judgments, which is really where all of the legal requirements lie, and where the kind of moral justification for the use of force lies, that you have to know that any killing that you're doing is justified. How do you know it's justified? It's not something a computer can just determine. And so we've seen these reports in the press recently about the Lavender system, as well as the Gospel and Where's Daddy, and a bunch of related kinds of systems. Of course, Gaza is a heavily surveilled state, so they have a lot of automatic cameras and data acquisition systems that are, constantly looking for people that they believe, that the IDF believes are part of Hamas or associated with them or supporting them in any way, and using algorithms to determine that. And then using also these algorithms to locate and track individuals. There's even a system that tries to determine where they live so that they can attack them at their homes, which raises a huge number of questions about, targeting civilians, and even what the ICRC would call civilians participating in armed conflict, direct participation essentially versus indirect. So, are you supporting Hamas because you feed your family every day? And right, like, is that the criteria being used? And from the journalistic reports, it seems the criteria that are being applied for discrimination, and especially for proportionality, which is, how many civilian casualties are acceptable to take out a given target, have just been kind of raised to, what are, completely unreasonable and inhumane standards, that it's okay to kill 20 people to take out one low level, innocent civilians, to take out one low level soldier or operative or supporter of Hamas, and then for high level targets that it's acceptable to take out hundreds of people, innocent civilians, and of course the devastation to civilian infrastructure is obvious. And what we've been concerned about in this kind of systems is that what you wind up with is because automation is ultimately about increasing efficiency, which means production, which means more killing more quickly in the smaller amount of time with a smaller amount of resources, right? That's the ultimate objective. And so what we've seen is this very large scale civilian devastation, that these technologies are in fact speeding all of this up, and increasing the levels of devastation much more extensively. And that's incredibly concerning. So we're also hoping that, some of the work that we're doing is particularly around this concept of the human machine interface will also be applied not just to, individual autonomous weapon systems, but to targeting more generally. And how do we ensure that there's meaningful human control and judgment involved in all levels of targeting and throughout these kind of complex socio-technical command and control systems. I think you're muted there.
We cannot hear you, Bonnie.
Sorry, I think I'd learn after all these years. So a couple of things stuck out to me. One, again, was the idea of looking at the legal and moral issues, which is something else Alma mentioned, but also the need to monitor, that this concern about the speed of the development, the need to monitor that to avoid the devastation that Alma talked about. The concern that it's starting to lead to devastation, and things could get worse. So thank you for that, and looking at the not just autonomous weapons systems, but some of the earlier stages that could lead to that. So thank you, Peter. Also want to look at, despite these challenges, there have been numerous positive developments in the humanitarian disarmament sphere over the past year. And turning back to Peter, the UN General Assembly resolution adopted in December, and the April meeting on autonomous weapon systems in Vienna were two that came to mind as the potential milestones for this issue. And could you elaborate, or at least, touch on what they entailed and their significance?
Yeah, I think we've gained a lot of momentum in the last year or so through the support of the UN Secretary General making a joint statement with the ICRC president calling on a treaty negotiation in the next 2 years. And that manifested itself in a UN General Assembly resolution in December, which asked the Secretary General to collect input from all states and civil society and generate a report to the General Assembly that will be delivered this fall. And Austria sort of spearheaded that resolution and also hosted this meeting in Vienna, which brought together a lot of states. I forget the number at the moment. I think there were over 1,000 participants. I think it's maybe 100 and some states that were present. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm. We think part of that is the public awareness about the importance of artificial intelligence and the transformative nature and very disruptive nature of it through the popularity of things like ChatGPT. But I think also these conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza have raised the awareness of this significance in the military domain. So states are very eager to do that. We've seen, group statements from Latin America and the Berlin communique, from the Sierra Leone regional meeting, and regional meetings in the Philippines and Luxembourg as well. So there's really a lot of global interest, and there were 264 votes supporting the resolution and only 4 against, usual suspects. So I think there's a lot of momentum and a lot of interest in actually moving this issue forward, even though we've been talking about it for a long time. So we're very hopeful that there'll be a strong resolution at the General Assembly this fall, and to really kind of move the discussion away from the CCW GGE, which is bogged down, I think, in the consensus format, where essentially every state has a veto power, and Russia very much exercises that at every opportunity. And the General Assembly is far more inclusive, far more democratic, and this is really where we've seen the last few disarmament treaties come from anyway, from the arms trade treaty to the nuclear ban treaty. So we really tried to get that as a forum. So we're hoping this resolution will move us much more strongly in that direction. There's always concern that a lot of states keep saying that the CCW is the right place to talk about this, so we have to dissuade them of this notion. And it's really these powerful states that don't want action on the treaty who keep saying that, because this is a place where they can control it, unblock it, and prevent it from getting outside the box, as it were. But I think there's a really strong global movement from smaller states, which is they recognize as the fact that those are the states where most of these armed conflicts occur, and that's the most likely place these weapon systems are going to be used, and that's where they have these serious humanitarian concerns about that, and are trying to really exercise their collective voice through the General Assembly.
Thanks, Peter. I think this is a really exciting development, and to got the potential to get at the conventional and conventional weapons, and the General Assembly is such a more, not just lack of consensus process, but also the more inclusive process of more states, and potential for a more time-bound, deadline process, and like-minded states. So I think this is a really exciting development. So, while a lot of attention's been devoted on the autonomous weapons issue, there's also been, progress with regard to other instruments, and many of which you've worked on, Alma. I was wondering if you could talk about some of those achievements over the past year or so, both either in general or in reducing some of the harm in recent conflicts, and just, some of the experiences you've witnessed.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak about success, because I think this would be a very difficult session to go through. But what Peter was just saying, we really need new laws and new instruments, because we have to keep an eye on the developments, work better, smarter, and even, I would say, harder to amplify our knowledge and to use what we know to strengthen the protection of civilians, especially with the new technology, new emerging technologies. And talking about success, it's sometimes a little bit difficult, because even today, and I think we can all agree on this, it's extremely frustrating for me to hear that, for example, Mine-Ban Treaty doesn't work, or conventional cluster munition doesn't work, while we have decades behind us where we have worked strong on these treaties and we have seen very good and positive impact. Let's imagine that more than 100 states still have landmines or cluster munitions, and that they use them or planning to use them, and that they have stockpiles ready to be used, and the production of these indiscriminate weapons is flourishing. So for me, it's very important to get us back to what has been done and how it was done, and what were the champion states that were leading that process. Imagine also that there is no targeted assistance for those that are affected, and from individual to community level, and that there is no international cooperation assistance to contaminated countries to clear their land and to use their land. So it means that we will be leaving this bunch of contaminated states they will be left behind, and they will never have the opportunity to develop. So I think overall, the nature of these treaties, like Mine-Ban Treaty and the Convention of Cluster Munitions, it's really important to reiterate how they are strong and how they are still enabling assistance to conflict-affected population and countries that need to clear their land. I think we have mentioned the EVIPA political declaration, and I think one of the successes is definitely related to, well, newly established political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. We had a conference that was hosted by government of Norway in April this year. It has resulted with a very strong outcome document, and also with the formation of this Troika group consisted of 3 states, Norway, Ireland, and Costa Rica. Additionally, Costa Rica has announced that they will host the next implementation follow-up conference in 2025 in Costa Rica. And given the current context and continuous use of explosive weapons and how this subject is sometimes being politicized, I think we should not take for granted stepping up of these states and teaming up to jointly work on this political declaration and this initiative, which is not legally binding, but still very important. When I get to explain what I do to people that are not in our sector, they always ask me, what would happen if you would not be doing this job, or this whole sector would not exist? And it's a little bit difficult to say what would happen if we haven't been doing this, because I tend to believe that things would get worse. And this is what really brings me to the ATT treaty, because I believe there would be a cascade of consequences, of negative consequences, if ATT was not in place. The regulation of international arms transfer would be weakened, opening the opportunities to increase proliferation of weapons, and this surge in arms availability would increase the risk of conflicts and escalations, with, again, devastating impacts on human lives and global stability. And without the treaty's provisions, human rights violation could soar as arms flow unchecked to oppressive regimes and non-state actors as well. And such unregulated trade would undermine general international peace efforts and strain diplomatic relations. And beyond even human suffering, conflicts fueled by unrestricted arms trade inflict lasting environmental damage as well. In essence, the absence of the ATT, I believe, would threaten not only peace and security, but also these very foundations of global progress and cooperation. And to speak about the continuous success, I think through all the disarmament initiatives, and maybe I'm biased to say this, we made sure that involvement of survivors and people with lived experiences, people from affected communities, were given a stage, first to express their needs, not only to share the stories, but to express what are the needs, and also to give an insight and to be involved in the policy-making process. And I think this aspect of inclusion was something that makes humanitarian disarmament very unique. I think now it's almost a norm not to have discussions about policy changes without consulting those who should benefit from these policy changes. And even though it sounds very logical, it's not taken as it was not taken as a practice. And this is also getting a little bit challenging, and I really need to stress this out because we have been facing different challenges when we want to engage affected communities or people with lived experiences or survivors, because more often they're not people living in active conflicts or protracted crisis. They do not have the luxury of personal protection. In some contexts, raising the voice means putting the one life in additional danger. It has been and will continue to be one of the greatest challenges that we are facing right now. But I also keep being sort of impressed on how we are all together navigating this to make sure that states are hearing what are the needs and what is the reality where we are acting. And these are really practices that we have nourished through the advocacy towards the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and we are strongly pushing for the same practice on explosive weapons agenda. In Oslo, we had a great representation of persons with lived experience, survivors, and affected communities, and we have managed to, again, put back the discussion from weapons and technicalities to the humanitarian aspect and human needs. At the end, I would also like to say that I strongly believe that there is a need to always call for new laws and instruments. Existing treaties like Mine Ban Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and Arms Trade Treaty, they play a crucial role in reducing harming conflicts. And while, as I said at the beginning, it's difficult to talk about the progress now, work on humanitarian disarmament has to continue. We need to keep a close eye on the current conflict. What are military using? What are their policies and practices of the choice of weapons? How to collect evidence and data? We should not measure our overall progress by looking into a behavior of few countries or individuals, but really globally look into what were the results that we had so far. For example, in Ukraine, we have seen evidence of the use of landmines and cluster munitions by both sides, civilian casualties, and hindering humanitarian efforts. The international community's response on the use of these weapons legally banned in Ukraine should have been stronger, but it has been shaped by the norms established by these treaties. So if there were no treaties, nobody would actually speak about them. And efforts to provide demining and assistance to victims and condemn and stigmatize the use of such weapons have been enabled by the framework set by these treaties. So the treaties have reinforced international norms against the use of landmines and cluster munitions and irresponsible arms transfers. This had created a global environment where such actions are increasingly condemned, even by non-signatory states, leading to a broader impact on global peace and security in the world that we live in.
Thanks, Selma. I think you highlighted a lot of the successes of humanitarian disarmament, both in terms of norm settings, such as as you said, the transfer and clearance and affected victim assistance, but also in terms of the process of including affected communities. And one other thing I wanted to add to the importance of new law, it's also strengthening existing law. One thing I work on is incendiary weapons, which is another area that we're not highlighting today, but that we're strengthening law that exists under the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but is woefully inadequate, is an area that is being worked on in the humanitarian disarmament sphere. Alma, I want to come back to you, and I also want to remind people, I see some questions coming in the Q&A, but we will be turning to the Q&A shortly, so encourage people to add questions to that box. Looking at humanitarian disarmament as a tool, not just specific as positive developments this year, but all the issues we've talked about fall under humanitarian disarmament, and how, looking at it more broadly is how it can be used as a tool, either through its purpose or its process. Alma, you've worked on a number of issues multiple issues over the number of years, and I was wondering what lessons you think can be learned from past experiences about the benefits of humanitarian disarmament, how they can be applied in the current situation.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think I have spoken about successes and how disarmament plays a vital role in mitigating harm and fostering the safer environment for all. So I think all these successes that I have mentioned could be really answered in this question, but I would still like to highlight some of the key successes and maybe lessons learned from our past efforts. And one of them is the importance of this multi-stakeholder approach. And I think this is, again, one of the specificities of the humanitarian disarmament. These strong partnerships with states, international organizations, and civil society are essential. And when states take ownership of disarmament treaties, their commitments extend beyond mere compliance. It becomes a shared mission. And civil society plays a crucial role in this dynamic, driving advocacy and policy work and ensuring that the voices of those affected populations are heard and the policies are tailored towards their needs. So this collaborative approach not only enhances the legitimacy of these treaties, but also strengthens their implementation and informants, and then it makes us feel that it belongs to a broader community and it's a responsibility of all of us. And I think that's really something that it's important to highlight in the lessons learned that we have. We must continue to champion humanitarian disarmament initiatives that are reducing human suffering, from landmines to cluster munitions to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Our efforts have already made a significant impact, yet there is still much work to be done. We must remain vigilant and proactive, pushing for adoption of new measures to address the evolving landscape of urban warfare and what Peter was talking about very recently. Where gaps exist, we must negotiate new agreements that reflect the current realities. We have to, and I cannot reiterate this enough, always keep our eyes open. We must not let some states water down the text and legal obligations by spinning them around in fancy language and caveats. The obligations that they have are a minimum to what they should do. So watering them down doesn't make any sense. Only collective engagement should lead to make sure that the progress is there and more stable and peaceful world we live in, filled with opportunities rather than wars, conflicts, and weapons. And I think we have a good lesson from our past experience. These lessons are very clear. Effective humanitarian disarmament can mitigate the horrors of conflict. Emerging technological threats require innovative solutions and understanding of the broader community of the dangers posed. And this multi-stakeholder approach and cooperation is vital. And continued bold advocacy, bold, not just say something, but really bold messages is indispensable. So only by applying these lessons today, we can build a future where peace and humanitarian principles prevail and where we can say that we have done something that is valuable for protecting civilians in conflicts.
Thanks, Alma. And I think talk about bringing together different groups leads to my question for Peter before we turn to the Q&A with the audience. Peter, humanitarian disarmament can have an influence beyond the weapon sphere. And I was wondering if you could talk about how it's influenced other areas of social change.
Yeah, sure. I also want to kind of build on some of the things that Alma was just saying, because I think they're super important, and they also kind of come to many other questions in the Q&A in terms of what are concrete things and what's the way forward. I think we're at this moment of, somewhat of despair and dispirited sense that the international frameworks for accountability for holding states and individuals accountable is sort of falling apart. We've seen a lot of Cold War era treaties getting ripped up, and a sort of pessimism, I would even say, amongst diplomats of there being any new treaties or international cooperation and agreement in this area at all. And I think we have a very important role in reversing that trend, that there's a lot of work to be done. And But we've also accomplished a lot, right? And we shouldn't forget that. And when we see states who defy the International Criminal Court or even sanction the International Criminal Court, as we've recently seen the US and Israel trying to do, they realize that the norms that we have been established by civil society and human rights and humanitarian law over the last, post-Cold World War II era are incredibly powerful and meaningful, and they're trying to resist that. Right? They're trying to hold on to the power that they have, or they believe military power is to their advantage, and so they want to continue to exercise it. And we have to continue to assert these norms and reiterate these norms and establish new norms for, the use of new technologies and autonomy and things like that, to, pushing back on things that have been acceptable maybe in warfare for a very long time, like the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, because they're just not acceptable and they don't conform to our norms and our morality and legal frameworks. That's not going to be easy. But on the other hand, I think to build towards that future, we need opportunities for states to actually come together and have these discussions and to show their support for a new treaty, like a legally binding instrument on autonomous weapons, to pitch my own. But in a lot of these different areas. And, states are going to resist the International Criminal Court, but that just proves, I think, as almost saying, like those norms are relevant, and they're scared of the assertion of those things. And the role of NGOs and civil society is to help articulate those norms in ways that states aren't often able to. And to give voice to the victims and the people who are directly affected by these things. And with my own International Committee for Robot Arms Control, we're a group of experts. So we're academics who do, law and philosophy, but also computer science and robotics and engineering. And we know a lot about these technologies, and we know, what they're capable of, but also what they're not capable of. And we need as civil society and as scientists to be able to articulate that to diplomats and to politicians and even to the military who don't really understand how these things work and what risks are really implied by them. And historically, we saw that, from Oppenheimer to Bertrand Russell and Einstein and the Pugwash movement and Andrei Sakharov, that it was a lot of the atomic scientists who really pushed and put pressure on governments to do something about nuclear weapons early on. And I think there's a lot of space for that. And we're starting to see also a lot happening, to come back to your question, and from like Silicon Valley and a lot of the people developing AI who are very concerned about the broader social implications of AI in almost every area of life, as these more and more systems become automated and make important decisions about our lives. And we've been working on this issue at an international regulatory level for a decade. And a lot of the concepts we've developed, like meaningful human control, that came directly out of these discussions have been used now for many years in self-driving cars to talk about what does it mean for a driver to take over the control of an automatically driving car, and how do we regulate and think about that. And I think the framework that we come up with for a legal regulation on these kinds of systems can be a model for regulating other aspects of artificial intelligence in more civilian areas. And I think there's a lot of space for civil society in those discussions, which even with the EU laws and AI, a lot of that's getting heavily influenced by industry and companies who have these strong financial interests in the outcome of those things. But we need a participating civil society. We need the public. We need the scientists and experts who aren't just working for those companies, informing us about what the implications of what these regulations are and what these systems might be doing to help shape that, so that we have a technological future and an arms control future and an international framework that really works for everybody in the globe and represents the interests of civilians and civil society.
Thanks, Peter. And I think that's a great way to sort of wrap up our discussion, talking about some of the positive, role of civil society and the positive role that an important role that humanitarian disarmament can play. I want to turn to some of the questions, and some of them I think can be merged together. if so I'll start with one that's going to sort of merge Carolina's and Steve Goose's. They both deal with the issue of, again, building on the discussion of the role of NGOs and looking more specifically at what concrete actions NGOs can take, not just their importance, but what specific actions NGOs can take to fulfill the agenda of humanitarian disarmament. I guess that might be a question for either of you or both of you. Someone want to speak to that? Maybe Alma, you want to start? Since I just
Sorry,
talked.
can you hear? Am I still here? Because I've lost you from my screen.
Oh,
We can still see you. You're still here.
Okay, great. I have you back. Sorry.
Okay, did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question. What are the concrete actions? I think the role of the civil society is to really mobilize groups around an issue and to keep bringing the evidence to the states. And we are bringing the evidence through different ways. Of course, some of them are research and data collection. Some of them are testimonies collections, involvement of affected community survivors and people with lived experiences. But I think this is something really that is important for us to bring the evidence and then frame a request related to those evidence on the policy asks that we want. So nothing that we are coming with is out of thin air and unrealistic. It's based on the impacts and the needs of people that are affected by a certain problem. And then second thing is the mobilization of the general public. For all of these issues that we are doing, we need to mobilize the general public and speak to people that are not concerned by a war in Gaza or in Yemen or in Sudan, but they have to be aware of what is happening and what are the roles of their governments in supporting a peaceful resolution of these conflicts, or is it fueling weapons and enabling people to get injured and killed and infrastructure destroyed? So I think that's the second thing that comes to my mind, is really this mobilization of the general public. And then the third thing is the mobilization of the political parties and parliamentarians. Maybe not political parties, but parliamentarians, to really bring these subjects and issues on the national, but sometimes even on the local level, and that helps us to engage and mobilize the wider community to talk about this issue, because politicians and parliamentarians, they are always welcoming initiatives, and I think it's bringing them evidence on why they should be engaged and what we ask from a certain state is one of the lessons learned again that we had, that was very useful to engage on different disarmament initiatives. That's all that comes on top of my head, but maybe Peter has some more suggestions.
Thanks, Alma. Peter, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
No, I mean, we can make sure we have time for some of the Q&A questions.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting about looking at the different levels of, international, regional, public, all evidence-based. Peter, there was a question specifically addressed to you about what are the greatest challenges in monitoring the development of autonomous systems, and how do you see, what are the possibilities for overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, and I want to tie it together with the question from the anonymous about media coverage of some of these AI-generated weapons. And I think I actually teach in a media studies department, so I'm very aware of that and talk to my students quite a lot about it. So it's very difficult and sort of a double-edged sword that we have this social media that's much more democratic, and a lot more information is able to be transmitted about what's happening in a conflict much more rapidly and to many more people, and without all of the vetting and even control of more mass media formats. On the other hand, it's very difficult to verify a lot of the information that comes through those channels. And as a smaller organization in the grand scheme of things, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots doesn't have like a field team that it can send into conflicts to investigate a given attack and try to determine what kind of system was being used and how it was operating or anything like that. So we're pretty reliant on journalists and media coverage and what winds up in the public domain about how various weapon systems are working. And a lot of that is even, sort of self-reported from a lot of different companies and things like that. So there's a lot of challenge in really knowing how this stuff works. And some states have raised that as an issue in terms of verification of a given instrument. And that's why I think we've focused a lot more on positive obligations in terms of the treaty that you have to demonstrate how a system is being meaningfully human controlled if you want to use that system. And I think from our perspective, at looking at the media, that we try to process it as much as possible and make our best estimates of what's happening there. A lot of the other issues with especially with mainstream media, but also I think in social media, is that certain things become a kind of hot button issue, and sort of just being able to say something is somehow related to AI makes it newsworthy. When really, I think a lot of the story is really about the humanitarian crisis, right? And it's about the effects on people's lives and the civilians who are being, brutally murdered and displaced. And a lot of times the technology isn't the center of that story, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be. I think, we all should be aware of what's happening, and we should be concerned about these future developments, because more and more they're going to be shaping these conflicts. And of course, they're trying to actively use these technologies to avoid responsibility for the kinds of war crimes and things that we're seeing committed. So I think we have to be very careful about that, and making sure that we actually identify the humans that are responsible for these decisions and actions, and holding them accountable, and not letting them say, oh, it was an AI or a system that did this, and so we're not accountable for that.
Thanks, Peter. Which actually leads to the next question I was going to pose, or from Chiara, about how could we strengthen accountability regarding the inappropriate or illegal use of conventional weapons, and if there are any frameworks for what you think accountability might look like regarding autonomous weapons. So I guess that's a question to both of you. Alma, you want to start?
Yeah, the first thing that comes up my mind is again related to the data collection and the evidence that could feed into having a complete set of information about the use of a certain weapon, where it comes from, and so all this chain from the moment when the weapon is deployed to the moment that it was used. So I think this evidence and collection and building a database with specific events to ask for accountability and follow up different courts which are set up or to be set up in the future is something where we could push for states. And I think having an open dialogue and asking for more transparency from states is, well, it's actually something that they already have to do, but maybe pushing on that button as well would be useful to make sure that the information that we receive are transparently given by states, and that are in line with what we see in conflict affected countries, because sometimes these transparency reports are not completely the same as what we collect on the so those are the questions that answers that come to my mind of these questions. And then there is as well, accountability towards the affected population. What is the role of states that have been using or selling the weapons to a certain conflict, and the damage that they have created? What is the accountability towards the affected population, and what is the damage that they have to heal or they have to work on to ensure that there is stability and life in these affected areas? This is something that I think several European countries have been working on to ensure that there is aid and development support for countries that have been impacted or damaged by the use of weapons. But just, this evidence data base could be a good start to build the case and then look for accountability from states.
Thanks. And Peter, did you want to address that in the context of autonomous weapons? You started to, but
yeah, sure. And also just to build on what Alma was saying, the Arms Trade Treaty is primarily about this transparency of trades. There's some conditions on transfers to conflict areas and things. But I think when we're looking at autonomous weapons, if you want accountability, you have to have transparency, right? You have to be able to link individual choices and action to the actions that result in harm and be able to hold people accountable for that. But actually, computer systems and automated technologies generate tons of data. So, like a flight recorder in an aircraft, these systems need to be, there need to be requirements that all of the data that's going into that system be kept and analyzable. Obviously states aren't going to share it with each other, but they should be doing internal reviews of it. But that creates, essentially a trackable system that we can see who is actually responsible, how systems are being worked. If we compare this to, trying to hold people accountable for war crimes in an analog era, it's, eyewitnesses, maybe there's some documents, recordings of things, but it's a lot of work to actually gather all of that evidence and put together a story and prove, beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody had the intention to commit a war crime. Where, these systems are going to generate a lot of data, and if we can access and analyze that data, we can start to really hold states and individuals accountable for the kinds of actions that they're taking, and in a proactive way, build legislation or law that's going to say that, in order to meet the standard of meaningful human control, to put autonomy into any kind of system, you have to have this kind of transparency measures in place that would then force them to have to do that. You know, it's always a case that it's hard to hold anybody accountable for anything in the end. But the establishment of these norms, the recognition of those, creates a sense of fear in the states that are trying to violate that, or the individuals who might violate that. And it gives traction to legal actions, right? Those aren't always successful, right? You still have to go to court and prove a case, and that's not always easy. But it gives you something to work on that's concrete, right? Or again, to some of these other questions about what we can do as civil society and NGOs, it gives us a framework for, levying arguments, for holding account, power to account, really.
Thanks, Peter. So switching gears, another question several people were interested in is, what is the role of environmental protection as part of the humanitarian disarmament framework? Wondering if either of you could speak to that.
I could try.
I know a little bit about it, but if either of you have worked on it.
Yes, Bonnie, maybe you. Yes, please. Go for it.
Peter, or should I?
I mean, I could just briefly, say some things, which is a lot of the discussion around autonomous weapons is also these kind of free-ranging, long-range, long-term systems, right? There's interest in building like submarines that would operate autonomously for months in between, communications links and things like that. And these sorts of systems suddenly become part of the environment, right? And they could have all kinds of impacts on sea life and aquatic environments and ecosystems. And, who knows what all things are going to be happening under the water. And we've already seen this with submarines and sea mammals and the interference they're causing there with sonars and things like that. And that, releasing huge numbers of swarms of robots into some conflict, much like landmines or clusters, it has an enormous kind of environmental effect in a given area. So I think those are definitely concerns. And then there's also a question here about corporations and how do we hold them accountable? And I think, thinking about these sort of broader things, we focus, primarily on human lives and civilians and civilian infrastructure and the disruption of that in armed conflict. But of course, the disruption of the environment also is a form of humanitarian disruption. And a lot of these corporations are not states, and they have enormous amounts of power, especially in terms of data collection and things like that. And I think we have to kind of broaden some of our traditional notions about, what is a military system and how does that work, which I think is another reason to move our discussion from the CCW that's very focused on a kind of archaic, historic notion of what is a military operation and a military weapon, to a GA where we can also talk about human rights issues. because these systems are going to be used for policing. And we've seen mass surveillance systems in Gaza. We've seen mass surveillance systems in Shenzhen of the Uyghur people. We've seen corporate mass surveillance in the United States and the Western world by Facebook and Amazon and Google collecting vast amounts of data about people that can be used for any number of purposes in the future. And how do we try to hold those kinds of groups accountable? And those systems, which we've seen, Google starting to develop target recognition systems. Well, if you have a single company that has access to all of your personal data, and they're also, doing military contracts, and this is what we've seen with Lavender, that they're collecting all this data from social media, from, cameras in front of, banks and businesses, and integrating all of that into a target generation system, right? The interface of these kinds of systems and the convergence of these technologies goes beyond many of our traditional notions of who's responsible for conflict or the use of violence against people, and what goes into those decisions. And we need to, as a civil society, be expanding this discussion and calling these, companies and other disparate impacts of surveillance in the environment as part of this bigger discussion.
Great, thanks, Peter. I'll just add a couple of words on the environmental question. I think there's a lot of overlap with humanitarian disarmament, and actually the definition of humanitarian disarmament that we use is prevent and remediate arms-inflicted human suffering and environmental harm. One really good example is what they call the PERIC principles, the protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, that the International Law Commission, which is part of the UN, adopted in the UN General Assembly, recognized a couple of years ago. And those principles follow a similar pattern as humanitarian disarmament, that it deals with, prevention and remediation, and includes many of the principles. For example, it includes provisions on victim assistance and on clearance of what they call toxic remnants of war, in addition to explosive remnants of war. It includes, preventive measures, not bans on specific weapons, but things akin to that, as well as basic international humanitarian law. And there's also, the process is similar in terms of active inclusion of civil society is very involved, in partnership with the states. So there's definitely a lot of overlap. The Harvard Human Rights Clinic has been actively involved. So if anyone's interested in talking to me more about that, I'd be happy to do so. But I think it's a movement very much worth pursuing. Other groups that have been involved, particularly are PAX and the Center, the Conflict and Environment Observatory. So those are just a few words on the environment question, but I think it's really interesting to think about how there's an overlap with humanitarian disarmament. Since you brought up the corporations question, Peter, I think Jeff also had a few thoughts on that. Jeff, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, thanks. I weaseled myself into the conversation in the end. Also, Sandra, I'm responding a bit to Sandra's question about the role of arms manufacturing and holding them accountable when they sort of say that they have national export authorizations. Let's say actually there's a lot of interesting work being done on the business and human rights space. The event we had yesterday as part of the forum would be a good one to watch. We had a lot of conversation there about the arms trade itself and business responsibility. There's great work being done in Europe by a group called ECCHR and others. There's also interesting developments being driven by the Human Rights Council. There's been a recognition that the business responsibility around human rights should extend also to the arms sector. For many years, the arms sector China carved itself out as not being responsible because the government had given them permission. But there has been recognition that there are principles of business that apply to the arms sector. And the Human Rights Council has some reports. They've been taking up this issue in different ways. So we're seeing pressure in the business community in that space. I'd also say last year's theme for the arms trade treaty was around industry and the arms trade. The South Korean leadership didn't go as far as I think many of us would have hoped, but it did lead to a report and a recognition that these human rights standards should be things that arms companies have to take into account regardless of their governance, that they are individually responsible for this. There was an EU directive we were very hopeful would include the arms industry, which doesn't seem like it will this year, but there is moving and continued progress around social responsibility in the arms trade and some conversation about what this might mean on the human rights angle. There are at times investor initiatives to have human rights due diligence as part of company processes or specific actions taken. And as Paul Hannon mentioned in response to this question, there have been some amazing divestment campaigns that have occurred in the past around cluster munitions and other weapons, which have been very powerful, nuclear weapons as well. But I'll say that in this moment, it's going to be very interesting. If you look at the college campuses in the United States, a lot of those protests around Israel are often targeting specific weapons manufacturers that might be near those universities and encouraging colleges to divest their investments from those companies. So I'd say that this is an emerging issue that is taking on sort of popular understanding in ways. So it is definitely a good question and one to keep following. Thanks.
You're muted, Alma.
If I can, all these years and still forget to unmute.
Yeah, me too.
The question that Sandra and Paul have asked, I was talking about public mobilization. It was very useful to have those tools, to just go on the website and to see if your bank is investing in production or any relation to the cluster munitions or landmines. It was extremely well tool that we could have used to reach out to the general public and mobilize them against a certain issue or a certain problem. It is a pity that it doesn't exist anymore, but still we can use what was produced recently. And on the question, should we do that across the humanitarian disarmament campaigns? I think it's definitely a yes. It would really help us to work on mobilization, but also on that question of accountability in our work.
Thanks, Alma. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Peter, or should I?
I could just add a couple thoughts both to that and to one of the other questions. Yeah, we've done a lot of work with robotics companies who are very concerned about, producing civilian robots and the impressions that people will be very afraid of those if there's all these terrible killer robots out there. So it's also been useful to kind of bring industry into this discussion, which aren't necessarily arms manufacturers. And I think those are actually much smaller in number. And it's also been kind of very interesting to see the extent to which experts and engineers, particularly in the AI sector, who are very much in demand and they're very much a limited resource, who don't want to work for the military industrial complex. And so they go to work for Google, and then they get very upset when they find out Google is doing a military contract, or that actually the project they're working on turns out to be a military project, and they don't even know that. And so there's been, employee demonstrations and resistance within those companies against those things. And that's been a very powerful form of organizing and speaking out. And making it known that, those sorts of things aren't acceptable. And there was also the question about Oppenheimer and just kind of not so much about the nuclear weapons, though I think it has raised a recurring awareness. I think a lot of people thought, nuclear weapons, the Cold War is kind of over. And it's not something we need to be worrying about as much anymore. But with, I think, the conflict in Ukraine, with Russia threatening to attack nuclear plants or use nuclear weapons, the possibility of escalation, I think obviously a lot more concern around that. But at the recent meeting on autonomous weapons in Vienna, there were many mentions of this being our Oppenheimer moment, that AI technology is much like nuclear technology was in the 1940s. AI is kind of reaching that point where it could have these enormously devastating consequences or enormously productive civilian applications. And it's up to us to develop, the infrastructure, the regulatory structure, the accountability and responsibility. But it's unwritten, right? We have to articulate that. And I think that's a super important role for civil society to say, like, these are acceptable uses, these are unacceptable uses, and push to turn that into, codified regulatory framework.
Thanks, Peter. And we wanted to wrap up around now, so I'm going to conclude by thanking Alma and Peter for their great comments and engagement on these issues, and Jeff for co-organizing the event, and also for the audience for your attention and great questions. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to them all, but we did want to wrap it up around now. Jeff mentioned this in the chat, but when you sign off, there'll be a quick survey that will pop up when you exit, and it'd be great if you could fill it out so we can continue to sharpen and improve these events. And there will also be some follow-up resources that will be emailed and available online in the coming days. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate your attendance, and look forward to seeing you at the next Forum on the Arms Trade event. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. All right. Yeah, do you want us to stay or are we done?
We're done. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Alma.
Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks
both.
to you,
See
Jeff.
you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Bonnie.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
Bonnie.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks.